asked me yesterday if I would put together some thoughts on kind of an overview of what's happening plus and minus in the Northwest. And I thought I'd be glad to do that, and that's something that I could do if you all were willing to put up with this being put together kind of at the last minute. I could do just from the knowledge that I have, because it's what I do all the time. My name is Bill Wassmuth. I'm director of the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment. We're a coalition in the 5 northwestern states of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. We formed in 1987 to address the issue of bigotry based on race, religion, sexual orientation, and we added gender to that last year because increasingly it's becoming evident that crimes based on gender, particularly crimes against women, some of them fit all the criteria of a hate crime. And so Washington State this year, as I'll mention in a minute, for example, changed their malicious harassment law to include bias crimes based on gender. So we've added that in as well and are kind of working out what that all means. We monitor supremacist activity. We monitor hate crimes. We provide resources and work for community-level organizing throughout the region. We promote legislation. We promote law enforcement response to implementing that legislation. We work on educational and public awareness kinds of things around these 5 northwestern states. We've been very involved with a lot of the local communities in Montana that have set up task forces, and we've been very involved with the network and work closely with the network and support very much what the network does. So that's a little bit about the coalition. I've got some things here because I'm doing a presentation in Missoula on Sunday, and I just did one in Butte, so I brought some of my materials along. This is a little flyer about the Northwest Coalition, if you're interested in it. Hi, George. George is the one that hosted me in Butte, so I stayed with him the other night. A little bit more about the coalition, and also if you are interested in becoming an associate member of the coalition, or if an organization that you belong to is interested in becoming a member of the coalition, that's what this form is about on the back here. If you want to just get on a newsletter mailing list, if you want to sign up here, we'll make sure that that happens for you. This is a resource list of just some other national and regional organizations that you might find of interest as you work on this issue of human rights. Anti-Defamation League, Center for Democratic Renewal, etc. And this is a short bibliography that is particularly has to do with supremacist materials. Materials about supremacists, I should say. And a lot of these materials that are here for reference are also on this list, so you don't have to write down all the information if you're interested in pursuing that. Along the lines of what Jessica was saying and what was part of the theme throughout this last presentation, I believe that we need to get about the work of healing. And I believe one of the groups that's doing that on the issue of bigotry and prejudice is a group called they do prejudice reduction workshops, and it's called the National Coalition Building Institute. Their prejudice reduction workshops are day-long kinds of events in which people come to grips not only with their own oppression, but also with how they have been oppressors or are oppressors themselves as well. It's a healing kind of thing. It brings people together. It's an introspective thing, but I think something that can be very positive. I've gone through the process. I like it. It's also something that people can become trainers in themselves so that they can carry it out in their own communities. So that's what this flyer is about. We've helped organize the Seattle chapter of the National Coalition Building Institute, and there's some others forming around the Northwest as well. It might be something that you'd be interested in looking at a little bit more. These reference books that I have, if you want to learn more about supremacy, this is the best one. It's called Blood in the Face. Blood in the Face doesn't have anything to do with violence. It has to do with the Aryan belief that if you are an Aryan and you slap yourself on the cheek, you will blush. You will have blood in the face. You can only check this out on yourself. You can't check this out on your neighbor. Slap them around and see if they blush, and that doesn't work. This is current, and it's got pretty accurate information, and if you want to know more about supremacist groups, this is one of the best ones. When hate groups come to town, materials from them that are available to schools. This comes from Southern Poverty Law Center. It's called Teaching Tolerance. It's available free of charge twice a year to anybody, any teacher who asks for it. It's filled with teaching aids kinds of things. So that might be of interest to you. And this is a a book of school policies that have been used around the country so that school districts don't have to start over completely from scratch when they're looking at having some policies in place in terms of dealing with bigotry. So, some materials for you here to look at. One of our jobs as the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment is to try to stay current on things as much as possible and to share that information around with other groups throughout the region. We want to do that kind of networking. And so that's why it would be fairly easy for me to kind of do a state-by-state run with you today, talking about some of the problems that are present in each state and some of the solutions that are taking place, and particularly some of the organizations that have formed to address some of those problems. So, starting with the state of Oregon, in terms of supremacist racist activity, Oregon has the largest population of racist skinheads in Multnomah County and the city of Portland, the largest population of racist skinheads in the Northwest. It varies in number between 100 and 200. They have been notorious there and very criminally active, particularly since the murder of Mulugeta Sarah in 1988, an Ethiopian national. Yes, Tony?
Now you say racist skinheads. This is like some name they've given themselves, I assume.
The skinhead movement?
Yeah, they call themselves skinheads.
Yes. The skinhead movement started in England in the 70s. And the skinhead movement at that time was a counterculture, punk rock, and counter-authoritarian, let's see how we can rebel against society and our apparent sort of movement. It picked up some of its racism from the United Front, which was a political racist party in Europe. When it came to the United States in the 80s, the skinhead movement was mostly racist, but not entirely. And so I'll always say racist skinheads, because there are some skinheads, counterculture punk rockers, who are not racist. The fact is, some of them are anti-racist, skinheads against racial prejudice. And in Portland, for example, the skinheads against racial prejudice and the racist skinheads battled it out with each other. In at least one case, in January 1 of this year, a non-racist skinhead in an altercation with racist skinheads killed a racist skinhead. So they're all autocratic, they're all anti-authoritarian, they're all counter-authority, but one of them adds racism into it and the other group does not. Portland has been struggling, and Western Oregon has been struggling with the racist skinhead movement since the late 80s, and it continues to be there. They still, as I said, the numbers go up and down, but between 100 and 200 in Multnomah County. They've shown up also down in Eugene and down the I-5 corridor toward south to California. Wherever the racist skinheads are for any period of time, there's violence. That's just a truism. That's happened in Oregon, that's happened in other places as well. These young folks who are ideologues and who are action-oriented will act out on their ideology and on the hate that they talk to each other about sooner or later. So in the Northwest, for example, in the last 12 months, a relatively small number of racist skinheads exist, 300 to 500 as far as we could count, but they've been involved in 7 murders. 2 in Olympia, 2 in Salem, 1 in North Idaho, where 2 racist skinheads killed a third, 1 in Tacoma, and 1 in Portland. So the racist skinhead problem is a constant one and exists very strongly in Oregon. Oregon also has Christian patriot movements, that movement that is anti-government, that believes that the government is controlled by the Jewish folks and therefore must be overthrown. Christian Patriot Association functions out of a little town called Boring in Oregon. There's also a Citizens Bar Association that proposes to use law to do all of this, functioning out of Medford. The Posse Comitatus started in Oregon in the 60s. Posse Comitatus is tied in with this whole Christian patriot movement as well. So particularly in the smaller towns and the rural places of Oregon, we see parts of the Christian patriot movement surfacing, parts of the Posse Comitatus movement surfacing. In terms of the anti-gay and lesbian battle, you heard some of that this morning from Jonathan Mazzocchi. Ballot Measure 9 was proposed and got enough signatures to be on the ballot in 1992. Ballot Measure 9 was a constitutional amendment that would have taken rights away from gay men and lesbians. It's not just a matter of somehow denying them any special rights. That's what the proponents of Ballot Measure 9 were trying to push. reported to police, and never are all of the hate crimes reported to police, so you can imagine that there were many more. The battle in Oregon split families over ballot measure 9. It divided congregations. It put employee against employee in the workplace. It was a horribly, horribly ugly, ugly battle. And the wounds of that battle are still very much present in Oregon. People who are exhausted, people who are tired, people who are depressed, people who are very, very strained because of that whole battle. And it's a long ways from over. What the proponents of ballot measure 9 did was simply after the election, they looked county by county and city by city and saw where they got a majority of votes, and that was in most little towns and in most counties. The ballot measure only lost like 46 or 44% to 56%, I think is what it was, and that was primarily because of the heavy population areas up and down the I-5 corridor, especially the city of Portland. And so the larger geographic area actually voted for ballot measure 9. So the proponents of ballot measure 9 could go city by city, county by county, and launch measures in those cities and in those counties. And wherever they have done that, they have succeeded to date. I don't think any of those have lost. Have they lost them? The proponents, ballot measure 9 type things have passed in every one of those cities and counties. And it's something like 6 of them a month or 2 ago and another 6 being proposed now. Meanwhile, the Oregon State Legislature passed a law that essentially declared any of these county and city ballot measure 9 type initiatives to be illegal. Meanwhile, the proponents of ballot measure 9 are challenging the constitutionality of that state legislature passed law. So, I mean, as you can see, this goes on and on and on and on and on. And people are constantly being torn apart by this thing. The struggle is rather horrendous. Yes?
Just a quick rundown of what ballot measure 9 says.
It would have forbade any use of state funds at all for any kind of program that would have provided any support for or any validation of homosexuality. So it would have, for example, taken homosexuality out of their malicious harassment law. It would have forbade the universities to have any classes on homosexuality unless those classes started out by declaring homosexuality to be perverse and unnatural. It would have removed any books about homosexuality that were not also framed in that this is perverse and unnatural from libraries. It would have removed any books from, or any courses from schools, etc. It would have forbade any cities, any counties, any legislation of any sort that would have protected homosexuality, homosexuals, gay men and lesbians from discrimination, that kind of thing. It in effect denied rights not just to gay men and lesbians, it denied rights to everyone. For example, we had our conference in Eugene last year. We held that conference 2 weeks before the election. But in fact, if ballot measure 9 had passed and had been in effect, we would not have been able to hold our conference on the University of Oregon campus like we did, because that would have been public taxpayer money supporting an objective discussion about gay men and lesbians. So it would have taken the right away from everybody else, as well as gay men and lesbians, to discuss this issue at all. Please, Marty.
Does anyone think that that would withstand any kind of constitutional scrutiny under the Bill of Rights?
Many say no, and hopefully that point of view would be true. But on the other hand, you know, if you did actually get a majority of the population to start passing that kind of legislation, and it's the attitude of the general population, whether it actually would have made it into effective law or not, it's the attitude of the population that's really of most concern. As you know, Colorado passed a similar measure 2. That was declared unconstitutional, but not on the grounds we'd have liked to think it was. It was declared unconstitutional because it wasn't worded correctly. And it singled out special things in relation to homosexuals rather than identifying the same things as applying to heterosexuals. So it was discriminatory because it left heterosexuals out. And therefore, it was declared unconstitutional. It's much more complicated than that, but that one has been declared unconstitutional.
Who declared that unconstitutional?
The Supreme Court of the state of Colorado.
So how long,
Given that the racist, what other meetings
Okay, some of the things that are happening in Oregon on the positive side. Oregon has very solid malicious harassment laws in place, and they have been upheld as constitutional by the Oregon Supreme Court just very recently. They also have in their malicious harassment laws the fact protection for gay men and lesbians, and they're the first state in the Northwest that passed that inclusiveness. They have a reporting law that requires law enforcement officers to investigate hate crimes as such and to report them through their agencies up to a central gathering spot in Salem. They have done an effective job with their law enforcement in terms of training them to investigate hate crimes. Oregon leads the Northwest on those kinds of legal situations and law enforcement situations. And partially because of that, when we document hate crimes, Oregon always shows the largest number. Of the 1,004 hate crimes that we found in 1992 in the Northwest, 585 of those were in the state of Oregon.
When were these laws passed?
They were passed in Oregon, I want to say in about 1987, 88, somewhere in there.
What was that number, 5? How many?
585 of the 1,004 hate crimes in the Northwest, 585 of those are documented out of Oregon. Well, partially they have more hate crimes because they have the largest number of skinheads, and the skinheads are responsible for a significant number of them. So indeed they do have a large number. But it shows up as even a larger number because the reporting system and the police reporting system is much better. We've got a circle going here that when people know that police will respond appropriately to a hate crime, they're much more likely to report it. When people don't know what the law enforcement response is going to be, they don't report them. So as soon as we get good law enforcement on hate crimes, then we suddenly see a very significant increase in the number of reported crimes. The reported crimes out of Wyoming is 0, because, as I'll mention in a minute, they don't have a hate crime law, but also because nobody trusts the law enforcement system there. The reported hate crimes out of Montana is pretty low, and we still got lots of work to do in this state on that same factor as well. Idaho along the same line. So it's a cycle that we get going. In terms of response to ballot measure 9, as one person said the other day, dealing with the impact of ballot measure 9 and the homophobic bigotry that's been a part of that has become a cottage industry in Oregon. There's a multitude of groups that are dealing with it. I'll just mention some of them that I think are being the most effective. Oregon Speak Out is a group that was begun by a number of lawyers in Portland, most of whom were gay men and lesbians. They decided that it was necessary to do a very thorough and very well-framed educational process in relation to ballot measure 9 on gay men and lesbian issues. And so they developed a speakers platform and a speakers bureau, and they made that speakers bureau available throughout the whole state. They were very, very effective in providing well-educated, quality speakers to all kinds of community groups and training them to be able to walk into hostile groups and turning the hostility into a good dialogue. I really like what they did. I think they've done a lot of good in terms of overcoming the myths and the misinformation and providing it on a non-shrieking at each other kind of basis. They've developed a network where they, through computer systems, communicate with each other and support some folks who are out in the hinterlands a little bit more. They've done an excellent education project. They're available, by the way, to come and do trainings to any group of people. And so if you wanted some time to have them come and train some of your folks on how to do this and their procedures, they'd be glad to do that. Oregon Speak Out.
Who's that fee for this?
Pardon me?
There would be a fee for them to come?
I think what he does is the first training he does almost free, just for expenses, just to get you started. And then after that, if you need him again, he's going to charge you a little bit more, assuming that by that time you would have something of a support basis. So, okay. Rural Organizing Project is another one that's very interesting. Realizing that the main defeat ballot measure 9 efforts were some of the people who ran the No on 9 campaign have formed a group called Right Watch. They're attempting to monitor the drift to the right of political candidates and attempting to see if they can't promote candidates in Oregon who are opposed to that drift to the right rather than just waiting for these rightish candidates to get in and then fight them. And one of the interesting things from our side with the coalition as well is that Governor Roberts last December organized a conference called the Hate Crime Summit. Seeing the constantly increasing numbers of hate crimes that were reported in her state, she challenged her human rights personnel in the state to set up some benchmarks in terms of turning that around and decreasing that number. And one of the things that was organized was a hate crime summit. Her affirmative action director for the state, Jeanette Pye, happens also to be the president of our board of directors of the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment. So she asked Jeanette to organize this hate crime summit, and a lot of the things that we believe in terms of the Northwest Coalition found their way into that summit, which was, from our side point of view, very productive. They gathered 700 people from around the state together, from all the little communities and counties throughout the state. They spent the whole day in Portland learning about hate crimes, but also beginning to organize on community levels. So now there's the potential, along with the Rural Organizing Project, of having community-based groups in almost every city, every little town, every little community throughout the state of Oregon. That's really exciting. We can bring the results of the Rural Organizing Project and the results of this hate crime summit together in these little towns. We're going to have some leadership people working together in almost every little community throughout the state of Oregon. That's going to make a difference. I'm excited about that possibility. Moving over to Washington, looking at problems first. The racist skinhead problem has never been quite as strong as it was in Portland and Oregon, but it is increasing in the Puget Sound area, particularly on the west side of the state of Washington. We're seeing increased criminal activity there, and we're seeing increased presence of racist skinheads there. Washington also has a functioning branch of the Populist Party. Its Sergeant at Arms is the head of the Ku Klux Klan in Tacoma, Kim Bedinsky, and a lot of its other leadership are former Klan members. The Populist Party, as you know, ran Bo Gritz as its presidential candidate this last year. Bo Gritz campaigned in Washington state on the Populist Party ticket, never willing to disclaim the fact that supremacists ran the Populist Party there. In eastern Washington, particularly up in Sanders County on the northern part of the eastern part of the state of Washington, we have a significant population and a growing population of Christian identity and Christian patriots. Christian identity churches there. Pete Peters has a radio station broadcast out of Colville. Pete Peters is a Christian identity preacher in Colorado. He gets a significant turnout whenever he chooses to come up to there for a public speaking engagement. And one of the local state representatives several years ago was the one that introduced Pete Peters at one of those little conferences. We caught that state representative at it, and the media embarrassed him significantly. His only response is, "Guys, I didn't know what this man really believed." Not quite good enough, since he'd had dinner with him repeatedly a little bit ahead of time. But so far we have not managed to expose him well enough so that people decided they don't want him to represent them anymore from that part of the state. That whole area ties in with the Christian patriots that you have in western Montana, in Sanders County. Northern Idaho, eastern Washington, western Montana. That whole area has a pocket of Christian patriot kind of activity, some of which came to the surface around the Randy Weaver affair when that standoff took place up in Ruby Ridge in North Idaho. A lot of the people who were there protesting that federal action were supremacists from Montana, from Knoxon, Montana, as well as from eastern Washington and northern Idaho. There are increasing Hispanic Anglo tensions in Washington state, particularly in the Yakima Valley in the center part of that state, where the Hispanic population, as is happening in many other places, is beginning to settle in and become a part of the community. As long as the Hispanic population was only providing transitory agricultural labor, no one seemed to care very much. But when they started settling in and becoming active on school boards and in community politics, etc., then the population became nervous, and in those communities where the majority population is already or will soon be Hispanic, the Anglo leadership is in some cases resisting. So we're seeing increasing tensions develop in some of those communities. In some cases, State faces a ballot measure 9 type of event this coming year in 1994. Lon Mabon from Oregon has formed the Citizens Alliance of Washington. There's another group that has formed as well that are set on promoting a ballot measure for November of 94. According to Washington State's ballot measure procedure, they can only gather signatures from January through July of that particular year. So they're gearing up right now. The signature gathering process will start in January. They need 183, I think, thousand signatures, and they're obviously preparing that march right now. So we will be facing in Washington State, as we will face again in Oregon. Forgot to mention that there's going to be a statewide ballot initiative, anti-gay lesbian ballot initiative in Oregon again in '94. Washington will be facing one as well, unless they do not get enough signatures to get it on the ballot in '94. Responses in Washington State. The laws in Washington State are now solid. The 1981 malicious harassment law of Washington State was declared unconstitutional by the state Supreme Court just a couple of months ago. But we all suspected that was going to happen. And so the legislature in Washington passed a new malicious harassment law that went into effect in July. That malicious harassment law also includes protection for people because of their sexual orientation and also because of gender. It's one of the few states in the union now that has a malicious harassment law that recognizes that bias crimes based on gender are also hate crimes. They have a reporting law in place as well now, and so we'll gradually be able to get more accurate statistics out of the state of Washington. The Northwest Coalition, by the way, as well as some other groups in the state of Washington, are developing a project to be able to educate and train law enforcement and others in terms of what bias crimes based on gender really might be and how to respond to those and how to deal with those, because it's kind of a new area. And so we want to promote this thing rather than just let that law sit there unused. Washington State has done a good job, too, in many places in terms of forming local community task forces. Kitsap County did one that has actually been formed by the county commissioners there. It's not a freestanding one. It's one that's under statute from the county commissioners and has a half-time staff person. They're doing an excellent job. One of the things that they do each year now, this year will be the third year, is they bring together leadership from the whole county. They bring together chiefs of police and superintendents of schools and elected leaders, mayors, etc., along with minority group leaders, along with community activists. They bring church and synagogue persons into that group. 2 years ago, we had 200 people there for a whole day to deal with bias and bigotry and hate crimes. They broke into business communities and education and law enforcement and people of faith groups. And many of those groups worked throughout the year. This last year, they came back together again and kind of reported on what they were doing and got some new energy and some new inspiration. This last year's meeting was scheduled on December 10th, and we had a freak snowstorm in western Washington and Kitsap County that day, and so only about 100 of the 150 people expected came. But it was still a good day. This coming year, they're having another same kind of thing, December 10th, Human Rights Day, UN Human Rights Day. I like that because it puts leadership in the community solidly together, working consistently to address the problem of hate crimes and bigotry. I think it's a real step in a good direction. Bainbridge Island over in Puget Sound has done some good work, too, in terms of forming a community group to address bigotry there, particularly some supremacist activity. In Stevens County on the east side did as well. When some supremacists moved there, they used that as the occasion to bring the community together. When they voiced their opposition loud enough that the supremacists moved out, they said, we've got some other problems going on, and so the task force continues to work to address bigotry on a bigger front. In terms of fighting the anti-gay and lesbian initiatives, people have gotten together in Washington State and formed the Washington Citizens for Fairness certainly do educational stuff, and we're working with Hands Off to do that. There is a group that's forming that's called the Washington Human Rights Coalition. That is a statewide organization of organizations that deal with human rights. So far, it's been kind of struggling due to a lack of staff or money. I'm not really sure what the future of that group is, but it might have the potential of developing into something akin to the network here in Montana, which, by the way, is a model for a lot of the states throughout the Union, and certainly a model for us in the Northwest. The Washington Association of Churches is getting very involved in this issue as well, and have developed projects and programs for these coming years that focus on bigotry as their number one issue. Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith for the region, centered out of Seattle, has done some good programs with schools, and they have one coming up in a few weeks, for example, where they bring together students and an advisor from a number of different high schools. They come together and spend a whole day dealing with students on how the students can help to work to overcome bigotry and prejudicial tensions within their school communities. So those kinds of programs are out there. Idaho. Most well known, probably in terms of problems, were the Aryan nations up in Hayden Lake. This is not my Chamber of Commerce speech because I used to live there, but it's important for us all to realize that the Hayden Lake Aryan nations thing is practically a thing of the past. And so when we're thinking about supremacy and thinking about Hayden Lake, we need to stay current about that. In the early 80s, Richard Butler was strong, and he was making that a compound with some national leadership. These days, he only has a couple of followers there. Most of his people have left him. He's gotten kind of senile about the whole thing. He's sort of a grandfather image to it. Hayden Lake Aryan nations is not the problem anymore. Certainly not the problem that it was in the early 80s. The events around Randy Weaver and the standoff in Ruby Ridge a year ago provided the situation for some people to start forming new groups, however, with something of the same agenda that Richard Butler had. But part of the indication that Richard Butler is kind of out of the scene is the fact that he and his followers didn't play any major role in that Randy Weaver affair at all. 10 years ago, he would have been right at the heart of that. Now he's sort of out of it, and other people took over that role. But a group that formed after the Randy Weaver affair is called United Citizens for Justice. Chris Temple from Montana, who ran the Bull Rights Campaign from Montana, is one of the co-chairs of that. John Troutman from Knoxon, Montana, is the other co-chair. They've had meetings in northern Idaho and eastern Washington and western Montana. Their point is to utilize the sentiment that's been built up by that event and other events around the country, the sentiment against government because they see government as oppressive, to use that as the rallying cry to bring together not only supremacists, but other people who are opposed to oppressive and large government. They've had Louis Beam be a part of their group. He's a serious threat out of Texas. So we've been watching them as closely as we possibly can. Only within the last week or two, we've heard that United Citizens for Justice has suffered some internal struggles, that somebody ran off with a bunch of their money. Not that they had a whole lot in the first place, but what little bit they had, somebody evidently stole. So we're not sure how strong they are or how unified they are these days. But it is a group that we want to constantly be monitoring as long as they exist.
Could you say a word about how you monitor that closely?
It's a combination of a number of different things. We work with some investigative reporters. So, for example, Bill Moreland from the Spokesman Review just a couple of weeks ago spent some days over in eastern and western Montana and northern Idaho and wrote an article about what he saw there in terms of supremacist activity. Bill Moreland is pretty good on this stuff. He doesn't sensationalize it. He reports pretty accurately. We use that. We talk to law enforcement agencies and exchange information with them to the extent that they'll share what they know with us. Whatever is public information, they don't share anything that's private, and we don't have any access to that kind of stuff. We talk to people in that area. We talk to people who are working in that area. Ken Toole from the Montana Network spends some time up there, for example. So it's a matter of gathering information from a lot of different sources and kind of putting it together.
Not infiltrating.
No, we don't do that.
What type,
We don't have the staff to do that.
what types of information is public to law enforcement?
Well, when there's criminal behavior, for example, but the FBI won't share intelligence information with anybody, for example. They'll share with us whatever buddy with Chris Temple. And so if we can monitor Chris Temple, we got a best kind of idea of when he shows up. Chris Temple's in the Ronan-Kalispell area.
And
We
these-
don't know where he lives, not kind of, we don't know where he lives, or.
His home still is Texas. Yeah, and so there's constantly word and threat that he might move up here, but so far that's not been validated. Louis Beam.
And I take it that he starts fires.
He's a terrorist. He's been in trouble with the law repeatedly. He's an old Klans person. He's been an Aryan Nation national spokesperson. He got in trouble for attacking the Vietnamese fishermen in the Gulf of Mexico. He's been constantly having problems. He's a covert operator. He works on leaderless groups, he says, which basically means you don't ever establish any visible leadership in an organization, because then the group can be attacked by attacking the visible leadership. So you have these cells of folks who are somehow covertly networked together rather than networked under any visible leader. So you won't see Louis Beam standing up in front of a TV camera like you see Richard Butler all the time. Right? He doesn't believe that. He won't be visible as the leader at all. He shows up here and there, but it's covertly all the time. He's a serious concern. He has the charismatic ability to pull people together. Many of these supremacist leaders do not, because they're so egotistical and they're so unbending that they can't really pull people together. But Louis Beam does have that ability.
He's very efficient.
Yeah, he's concerning. We see, so that the United Citizens for Justice is a concern for the whole area to the extent that they still exist. And we've only, like I said, in the last couple of weeks heard rumors that they might not be that strong anymore. Other things in Idaho, we see some posse comitatus stuff. And there's some strange alliances that form once in a while with posse comitatus and some of the other constitutionalist movements and some radical elements of the Mormon Church. I certainly don't want to imply that the Mormon Church is equivalent to any form of supremacy. I don't mean that at all. But Christian identity theology and Mormon theology both stem from the same root, namely British Israelism of the 19th century. And so while the Mormon Church keeps pulling their membership away from the bigotry that their roots would lead them to, the Christian identity folks play up to the racism that their theological roots lead them to. And once in a while, fundamentalist Mormons will bounce over to the Christian identity side rather easily. So down in the southeast corner of Idaho and in Utah, we see a fair number of Christian patriot types who have some fundamentalist Mormon background to them. We see some interesting networking going on there once in a while that needs more study. One person who has done a lot of study on that is a professor at the University of Idaho State University in Pocatello called James Aho. He's written a most interesting book called The Politics of Righteousness, which talks about how people get into these kind of supremacy movements and looks at it throughout Idaho, including that whole Mormon thing, fundamentalist Mormon thing down in the southeast. We've just seen some new stuff in Idaho in the Sun Valley Ketchum area. Two things. One is a young man was arrested there for an altercation in a bar, and in his wallet he had a neo-Nazi card from a group in Nebraska. That same group distributed some flyers from that same group. Some stickers showed up in Missoula right about that same time. It's NSPDA-AO, something like that, and those are the first letters of the German words that stand for Nazi, and then the last two letters are overseas affiliation. We also just received out of Sun Valley, C.W. Nelson, who is a known Aryan person, is starting to produce a new newsletter out of there. C.W. Nelson has some money from somewhere. He's also fairly eloquent and writes a fairly good newsletter and kind of plays in that more middle class and upper middle class stream. He's a golfer, for example. Not many supremacists play golf, but he does. So he might be able to pass himself off in that Sun Valley crowd a little bit easier. In Idaho, the growing tension between Hispanics and Anglos is happening as well, particularly in the agricultural areas of the Magic Valley and the Caldwell area. And it's the same kind of thing as I described for the Yakima area a little bit earlier. Idaho also faces an anti-gay ballot measure So while we might look at the LDS Church as a fairly conservative church, and in many ways they are, they as a church are struggling with the question of gay men and lesbian issues, just like a lot of the other churches are. And so they're not taking an absolute stand. They have modified their stand from years ago. So we need to be careful that we don't just sort of write them off as being automatically on one side of this issue. They are not. And individuals within the Mormon Church will certainly be on the anti-ballot measure side quite readily. Responses in Idaho, the laws in that state are pretty solid and have been tested in constitutionality and by trials, and they are used. The malicious harassment law comes from 1983. It is only malicious harassment based on race, religion, and ethnic origin. Does not include sexual orientation or gender. There is also a reporting law in Idaho that is helping that state some, but we need to do a lot of work in that state to have law enforcement officers respond appropriately to hate crimes. We know of cases where that's not happening well at all. This Hispanic home in Idaho Falls had threats painted on it a year or so ago, and the prosecuting attorney refused to deal with that as a hate crime, said it was vandalism, and it was death threats painted on a home of Hispanics. It fits all the criteria, including the attorney general said that it fit the criteria of a hate crime. But the prosecuting attorney in that county said no, and the young men that were caught for that crime simply got a slap on the wrist. Idaho has a long history of community-based task forces, from the Kootenai County Task Force in northern Idaho that is about 13 years old now, to the Ada County Task Force that's about a year old, that formed after they had had enough when the NAACP president there had a rock thrown through her bedroom window, a 20-pound rock at midnight one night that was covered with racial slurs and with threats. And the community said that's enough, and they formed a task force. That's a very, very good one. We like to see these task forces very broadly based, and Ada County's is. For the first time in the history of that county, the most out lesbian woman is sitting in a public meeting once a month with the chief of police, along with the superintendent of schools, along with a representative from the city and county government, along with community activists, along with other members of minority community, along with church and synagogue leaders, along with business leaders. It's a broad-based community group that's able to have some real impact in that community. There's a statewide project going now that the Northwest Coalition took leadership on. That's very exciting in terms of bringing together representatives from the various communities throughout the state in order to strengthen their local community activities, to develop new community groups where those are necessary, and to provide a network for them on a statewide basis to be effective statewide where they can. We'll be using the Montana Human Rights Network as a model for that group. We have that statewide meeting coming up in the first weekend in November. Idaho Voices for Human Rights is the group that has formed to oppose the prospective initiative that's coming up. And the gay and lesbian community has come together in the Idaho for Human Dignity and are conducting trainings around the state already as well. So one thing we learned from Oregon is that we can't wait to do education in the face of these ballot measures, and both in Washington and in Idaho, some strong efforts are being made already. Moving on to Wyoming, this won't take as long. Yes?
You might want to tell them about the conference at the end of this month in Coeur d'Alene.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. In Coeur d'Alene, the last weekend of this month of October is the International Human Rights Conference. This year we'll be focusing on women and women's issues. It's a conference that initially was primarily between people from Russia and the United States. It's now expanded a little bit beyond that. I think this is about the third or fourth one. I think the third one. One was in California, one was in Russia, and this one is in northern Idaho. They expect over 1,000 people for this conference. I didn't bring any materials along with it, unfortunately, but I can give you the name of the person to contact if you're at all interested in it. Tony Stewart is the chairperson of the planning committee, 765-3932. He used to be president of the coalition, that's why I remember that. 208-765-3932 is how you can get a hold of him. It looks like it's going to be a very exciting event. Tony Stewart. Wyoming is an interesting state on these issues. They claim to be the equality state. That's their motto, because they were amongst the first say much about how they're treated unless you visit with them long enough to where they start recognizing that you are trustworthy. Because it's such a minority population, such a small population, that it's threatening to them to even talk about how they might be mistreated. So there needs to be a lot of work done in Wyoming, and the people there, particularly the Wyoming Church Coalition, is starting to recognize that. In our gathering of hate crime stats, we have not been able to come up with hate crimes in the state of Wyoming simply because no one reports them and they do not have a malicious harassment law in place yet. This coming legislative session, they may try again, but the people who are promoting that legislation are rather insistent, as I think they should be, that if they do pass a malicious harassment law, they want that law to include people who are harassed because of their sexual orientation. And in Wyoming, that makes passing such a law very, very difficult. 2 years ago, when they tried passing this law, they were unsuccessful. In the same legislative session, they did pass a law that protected hunters from being harassed by animal rights activists. Some of us found that to be rather interesting, that these folks who were running around with their pickup trucks with the guns and the racks were the ones that needed to be protected from the animal rights activists, but people of color, etc., and gays and lesbians did not need to be protected from bigots. The Wyoming folks found that to be a bit ironic too, I might say. Some of the positive things that are happening there, a number of us spent a week traveling around through Wyoming, meeting with various groups in July. We met with law enforcement and with the governor, and we met with community groups as well. Law Enforcement Training Academy is interested in doing some things to provide better training for law enforcement agencies about hate crimes, even though there's no law in place at this time. So we got a good chance of doing some training at their academy during this coming year. That's going to be a real step in the right direction. The governor is also interested in doing some work along these lines to get a state law passed, but even to do some work before a state law is passed. And the Wyoming Church Coalition has been taking some leadership in forming community groups, and we're trying to see if we can get those groups in place and then convene a statewide meeting of them sometime during 1994 to provide some support for them and to provide some networking for them. And lastly, Montana, and I only leave it last because you're the ones that know about Montana, so just to summarize quickly what you already know. Supremacist activity in Montana, you have your share. Sanders County has Christian Patriots. Belgrade does down by Bozeman. The Bitterroots have some Christian Patriots presence there as well. 4 Aryan Nations leaders moved to Matson, Montana several months ago to form the Church of Jesus Christ Christian Montana version. Peggy Christensen has moved from Missoula to where? Libby. Is that where I heard that? She's Conrad? Condon, that's right. Yeah. That's where she showed up last again, right? Peggy Christensen is a Christian Patriot organization as well. Montana, Wisconsin, and Washington have the strongest anti-Indian organizations going. ACE exists here, All Citizens Equal. PAR as well exists to some degree. And more of that is documented in Ruby Reiser's book here, if you're interested in pursuing that. Some of that comes around water rights, and some of it comes around treaty rights, etc. And it's an extremely complicated issue, and I don't want to minimalize it or oversimplify it at all. But some organized groups are jumping into that confusion and are using some of the sentiments that are stirred up there to take out after Indian Native American rights generally. So you see that surfacing throughout Montana and Washington particularly, as well in our region as well as in Wisconsin. At this stage, you don't have a ballot measure in terms of the gay-lesbian facing you, but I would suspect that that's only a matter of time. As you know, during this last legislative session, and the battle over the attempts to include homosexuals in the malicious harassment law failed, and the attempts to repeal the sodomy law failed as well. And that stirred up the group that is the focus of some of the focus of this conference, namely the Christian Coalition. there in terms of how to word something that would pass or wouldn't pass.
There was a reliable anonymous source saying that it will be happening.
It will be happening in Montana in 94.
I keep hearing that too, that they're really, but, so I'm wondering what your sources are, Bill.
Well, what's your initiative process? When would they have to have signatures gathered for an initiative? Does anybody know?
About that.
Isn't that about right? We've got a real open, easy initiative process.
You do?
And they don't have to have their ducks in a row yet to pull it off. And I know they're holding meetings to kind of assess the situation. And so I think that it's the possibility, the wherewithal to do it is still very much out there. They haven't passed the point where they have to organize funds.
Okay, I was assuming that was passed and I hadn't heard anything. That was my only source.
Okay, because I
So there
think
is
we
still
are
a
all hearing
possibility.
that they've held meetings with the Secretary of State. They've kind of gotten their ducks in a row. They're meeting with potential allies to see who's going to be on board. And I think that they will be gathering signatures in the next, whenever it is that they can start.
Okay.
I think they probably will.
Okay, that means that it's important for you all to learn the initiative process as well as you can and figure out what that's about, to see where their needs are. Good, that's good information.
How big are they?
Pardon me?
How big is that Christian coalition? How many people and how widespread that is?
Does anybody know numbers in terms of the Christian Coalition and how widespread, how powerful?
Well, they have 2,000 people that attended that conference in my house a couple months ago. A couple weeks ago.
That was the Genesis, the Creationism conference?
But, no, they had another conference a couple of months ago.
Do they have open meetings that people?
No
attend?
one could attend, and they wouldn't even say where it was at.
Numbers are really hard to come by with them because they include a lot of church memberships that really aren't part of it.
I don't think in any case that we should underestimate the strength of the radical religious right under the Christian Coalition banner or of any other. I mean, that's basically how Colorado's law was passed, because everybody sort of said, you're from Colorado, everybody sort of said, this won't make it, not in good liberal thinking Colorado, there aren't that many religious right folks here. Wham, bang, there it goes. Oregon, with the measure that they were referring to in '88, the same thing. The only reason they defeated ballot measure 9 in Oregon is because they'd had the experience in '88 that they knew full well they could lose. The message that keeps going around in Washington is, this is a serious matter. It can lose. It could win in Washington. We could lose this one unless we work hard. The Christian right does not have a majority of people in their pocket, but they are very, very well organized, and they have a lot of money. And because of those two things, they are able to win elections, not because they have the majority of population, but they have enough of a population, they have enough organization, they have enough money that they can win campaigns.
I'm real curious how this plays out, for instance, in Oregon, and maybe also, in Washington, between the sort of Christian patriot or Christian identity and supremacist movement.
supremacists aren't going to want to associate a lot with the Christian Coalition because the Christian Coalition believes in taking over the political system. The supremacists do not.
But it's interesting to me, for instance, the coalition, how the issue played itself in Billings, that the Christian Coalition and that group of people has not made any effort to distance itself. Silence has really just been the response. But they've seen their issues taken up by these supremacists, and they haven't felt compelled to distance themselves or to say these people do not speak for us, or disassociate themselves from the Klan, which is interesting to me. That I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. That'd be a good thing to ask them sometime.
They get real defensive if you try to draw a parallel.
Yeah.
It's just a real hot button for them.
And I think because they know full well that that's the death of them. If you could make any solid ties, that would kill them. I mean, the vast majority of people aren't going to have anything at all to do with supremacy. And if you want to destroy anything, if you make any kind of tie to supremacy, you've done it in. Because that's only a very small percentage of the population that'll buy into that. However, when you talk about bigotry and more subtle forms of bigotry and prejudice, then you start speaking to a larger portion of the population. And that's what the Christian Coalition is going to play to more.
Is the parole movement overlapping at all?
The which
The parole movement.
I don't know that, and I don't know that anybody's really investigated that. My only feeling in terms of the parole movement is that they play also on the anti-government sentiment. And the scary thing to me about Perot was that so many people in the United States, in the initial part of his campaign, before they had the foggiest what he stood for, were willing to jump on his bandwagon. That if somebody else had come along with a charismatic form of bigotry, supremacy, that had, they could have played that same role and had all of these folks on their bandwagon before they committed at all to what they were about, because Perot didn't. I mean, for months, he didn't say anything about what he stood for, but people were willing to quit their jobs and give millions of dollars to support him. That just shows to me the desperateness of the American public to lunge after anything that has different from what we are now. And
Billionaire leading populist movement.
Yeah.
It's always been puzzling.
Yeah, it puzzled me too. But I think it points to how desperate people are for something different. And that's what was scary to me, is that that's the kind of stuff that makes a Hitler. They didn't have to explain what they were about. They could just simply be against something. And people jumped on the bandwagon simply because they didn't like what was going on.
Isn't that the source of much of the strength of the NATO institution? People are just so anti-government that they're willing to sign anything that hints that it's opposed to those guys in office.
I don't know about anything else, but I certainly think that there is a wave of that going through the United States these days. I mean, that's what Rush Limbaugh does too. I mean, he's making a living off of entertaining people on anti-government stuff. Right? He doesn't offer solutions for the most part. All he is against things. Rush Limbaugh, the talk show host guy, he makes a living off of entertaining people about anti-government stuff, and he just rants and raves about it. I think that's a fairly easy way for people to ride these days.
I was just going to comment that at least in Montana, there's some significant ties of the Christian Coalition into the anti-tax, anti-government petition process. And, the Christian Coalition worked pretty hard on the Nailsin petition. And some of their folks down in Bozeman are real interested in the school, the
people are jumping on board this one at the moment in order to build a network, in order to build name lists, et cetera. And then they'll take as much of that as they possibly can into this next ballot measure. So there is some using of these other movements, some ties there, but some using of these movements to build organizations that they can aim in other directions.
In the office building that I worked at in Great Falls, which is substantially large, there was two things that coincided. One was a talk by Rob Nadelson about a year ago, and then an anti-tax private group to help people petition their tax assessments started up about the same time. But the religious literature showed up in all of the waiting rooms around the building just at that same time, so we continue to watch that.
Yeah, interesting.
On tactics, at one time, you and the coalition were publicly quite hostile to pro-diversity, nonviolent groups that used vigils, demonstrations, rallies in proximity to supremacist gatherings as a means of engaging, confronting the supremacists, showing no fear for them and all. I'm wondering if that's still your position, and if so, why, in a short
Yes. The incident that the event that you're talking about there is the march in Coeur d'Alene in 1989, right?
and the vigils at the compound.
Vigils at the compound in relation to the Human Rights Rally in 86?
No, 'cause I don't think they were joined in any way. During the Aryan Nations Congresses,
That
for
was-
several years, there were gatherings that were criticized at the compound. There were vigils at the compound.
Well, from our side, what that was is in 1986, we held a human rights rally at the same time that the Aryan Nations were holding their gathering. And there were, our point at that stage was it would work much better if we stayed where we were and celebrated justice and celebrated diversity. And if we didn't engage the Aryan Nations directly, not because we were afraid of them, but because we didn't see anything constructive happening from that, and we were afraid that would provide the Aryans an opportunity to interact in a violent sort of way. We were also frankly afraid that some people on our side might be violent as well, because emotions run very high on those kinds of things. So when the group from Montana, particularly Missoula, wanted to go out there, our effort was to discourage them and encourage them not to. I don't think we publicly criticized them for that, though. I don't think the task force did.
I don't want to get into history.
Yeah.
The tactic now, showing up at ultra-right-wing events in a nonviolent fashion. Wise thing, not wise thing, something you're going to support?
Our policy officially on that is that there are times when we see that being productive and effective, and there are times when we think it is not productive and not effective. And so we consider each situation one by one. The most dramatic one was the anti-skinhead march in 1989. There's a lot of history connected with that one, and a lot of mistakes were made on all sides. We learned from that. Other people learned from that. We haven't repeated that sort of thing on either side since that time. We generally don't believe that sticking faces against faces and yelling at each other is productive. We do believe that public shows of strength against bigotry and supremacists are productive, and we've been involved in those since 1986. So I don't know if that's a change of policy. We formalized our policy on a one-by-one kind of basis. Sometimes we see these as being valuable, depending on what the outcome would be and what the instigation is. Other times we see them as not. We haven't been in any conflict with any groups about that since 1989, as far as I know. So, please.
Bill, I'm real curious about where cult-like groups like the Church Universal and Triumphant fit into this whole picture.
Well, generally they don't. Church Universal and Triumphant is a destructive cult group, and they have some curious wording about white purity, etc. But what that means, as far as I've been able to study it anyway, what that means is anybody that's converted is white and pure, no matter what their racial background is. That's the conversion process. We were concerned a few years ago because we heard some racist skinheads were involved in, with Church Universal Triumphant, in that when they started heading into their underground bunkers, they were leaving some of the security on the top to racist skinheads. Checked that out as much as we could and found out that that was bogus, that they weren't racist skinheads. And so it was a kind of misinformation stuff.
What was it you first said about cups?
They're a destructive cult. Yeah. So there are no organizational ties there, and indeed there wouldn't be with anything that has to do with Christian identity stuff. They would see Church Universal and Triumphant as being really off the wall, really being incompatible with their theological beliefs. You also got an organizational problem there in that destructive cults by definition follow a charismatic leader who is their high authority. And so you don't see destructive cults generally cooperating with other destructive cults either. I mean, they're homogeneous units that are very self-contained, and they're built around the ego leadership of one person. So they're not about to cooperate or intertwine with other organizations very much. To the good news on our side of things, the supremacists also are filled with those kinds of egos and that lack of ability to compromise enough to associate with other supremacists. So the ability to pull supremacist groups together, or the success ratio of that, is very limited. The racist skinheads, by definition, are unorganizable, and any efforts to do that have met generally with failure. The supremacy movement also doesn't organize very well. That was Butler's dream in the early 80s, and he was successful for a few years, but that's pretty much fallen apart now. When you get to that version of absolutist belief, then they're absolutist against other absolutists too. And very small little differences make it impossible for them to cooperate with each other. That continues to make them ineffective, or have as much effect as they might have. Tony?
I just wanted to let you know about another initiative in Montana. One of the MSU student senators trying to get the Christian Coalition in Montana to support financially and so forth an effort to get sexual orientation off of MSU's list of discrimination. People who don't discriminate against. And I'm from a philanderer group there in Bozeman, and we talked to like the dean of students and the Courtney Smith, I think is her name, and to make sure everything was okay, and that we found out that pretty much this senator had started this request. It's kind of out on the fringes of things. But he sent a letter to the Montana Christian Coalition, and they put this letter in their newsletter, decrying JP Betts, the Missoula student body president that's openly gay, as, oh, we don't want this to happen in Bozeman. And he's kind of in the fringes, so we don't think that's going to happen.
I think you're going to find throughout the country, but we're going to find in the Northwest, any place that it's possible, you will find petitions that are going to start challenging this stuff. In terms of removing books from libraries and censorship issues, in
discussing this said that they were already beginning to train their people in reporting.
Yeah.
I mean, they were already doing this.
In part, they have to because of the federal legislation. See, the federal law requires, or it doesn't require, it asks state law enforcement agencies to report to them on hate crimes, including hate crimes based on sexual orientation. And so the Justice Department has been trying to get local, state law enforcement people trained to deal with hate crimes, including hate crimes based on sexual orientation for the last couple of years. That's not a mandatory thing in terms of they'll start pulling funding if it doesn't happen, so it's a thing that's got to be worked through encouragement, cooperation, and all that, and that's got limited success. But that's where this is coming from, I suspect, is from that federal pressure.
And how many hate crimes are reported in 92 through the system?
Montana, according to our report, had 60, 40 or 60? Somewhere right in there. I don't have them. I do have the number. Sorry, I don't have that right in front of me, but I think it was 40 or 60.
Why is CUT destructive?
Pardon me?
Why is CUT destructive? Coloring group.
There's a definition of group, I mean, there's a definition that's used that establishes a number of criteria, and groups that meet that number of criteria are referred to as destructive cults. And Church Universal Triumphant meets those criteria.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what's been going on in Billings and some of the other Montana communities while we're still here.
Okay. Well, many of you know better what's going on in Billings than I do. Certainly Margie does, but she just left. Billings started experiencing some open supremacist activity through flyers in January. And the community of Billings responded very well in terms of pulling together a task force, a group of people that were opposed to this sort of stuff. They had a rally in May. They had 3,000 signatures of organizations and individuals in their newspaper. A strong voice from law enforcement also saying, step out of line and you will be arrested. A very loud, strong voice there. That's probably been, at least in part, the reason why there hasn't been any personal violence yet. On the other hand, during the Jewish holidays, during September, there were some anti-Semitic incidents that took place, threatening things, including threatening notes posted on the Jewish building that was used, the synagogue building, and desecration of the Jewish cemetery, with a bunch of tombstones being desecrated and overturned, etc. So the activity is continuing there. Good possibility that that's the result of only a small handful of people. It could be one person who's claiming to run the Klan and 3 or 4 who are claiming to be skinheads. Might be more than that. But generally when there's any kind of significant numbers at all to these groups, they'll show up in public as a group. And so far in Billings, I don't think that's happened. It's all been behind-the-scenes sorts of stuff, which tends to make us believe that it's a pretty small number of people that are actually involved here. But they are terrorizing the whole town. Particularly the think, to get to the next group.